So do you have any questions before we get started?
Well, I mean, just the only question I would have is where this actually does show up. I'm not sure if I get this sustainability spotlight.
Yeah, that's a good question. So this is posted on WaterNow's blog, which you can find if you go to our website. It's waternow.org/blog. And then this is a feature of our monthly newsletter, which we send out to, I think, a network of about 4,000 or 5,000 contacts. So, you'll, and I should make sure that you're on that newsletter. I'll make a note for myself that we have you receiving that, so you'll see it. But
Cool.
you'll kind of feature below the open introductory letter, and then it'll be our sustainability spotlight. It comes really early on in the newsletter. And then we also make sure that this gets out on all of our social media channels. So, we'll
Okay.
have Castle Rock Water, and, that'll be on Twitter and Facebook and LinkedIn, all of that.
Okay. Wonderful.
Yeah. It's been pretty fun. We started this about a year ago, and it's a fun, interesting part of my month to talk to water leaders and, get their insight into the work they're doing and, how they'd like to be advancing some of these solutions moving forward.
Cool. Yeah. No, I bet that is very interesting. There's a lot of cool stuff going around the industry and in Colorado in particular. So.
Definitely. And so once we talk, then I'm going to turn this around pretty quickly. Hopefully by Tuesday or Wednesday of next week, we'll have a draft over to you. So you can
Okay.
that, make sure that, everything makes sense. We do shorten the transcript a little bit just for brevity. And,
Sure.
so it won't be totally word for word what you've said. So you can make sure that it's everything, is clear. From your perspective, and then I'll just let you know. I think the newsletter is scheduled to go out the following Monday, so whatever that is, the 9th maybe.
Okay. Cool.
Yeah, the 9th.
All
Okay,
right. Wonderful.
so let's go ahead and launch in, and then, if there's any, we can kind of just see where this goes. If there's any questions, that come up as we're talking, we can go in that direction. If there's anything that, you don't feel like you have a super compelling answer for, then we can scratch that. This is pretty casual.
Okay. No, that sounds great.
Okay, great. So you began your career in utility management in Georgia, which I thought was interesting. How would you say the water challenges that communities face in Georgia are similar or different than those faced here in Colorado?
Well, so of course, many of the challenges are really the same. We continue to learn more and more about water quality, and of course, water providers are having to make adjustments in response to all the knowledge that we've gained and our ability, of course, to measure the water and understand what's in the water. So, that's a challenge that folks face everywhere. The other thing that's similar would be infrastructure. Of course, it's really expensive wherever you are, and water itself is still very inexpensive, relatively speaking. So maintaining that infrastructure over the long term, I think, is a shared challenge that, we have here and in Georgia. And rates and fees are going to be rising in both places, and nationwide in response to that challenge and trying to maintain all that stuff. And of course, Georgia is subject to drought. So even though they generally have more what we refer to in Colorado as renewable supply can still be an issue there. And Georgia is, and even when I was there 6-7 years ago, is certainly moving forward with reuse, for example, gray water and other things that are, on the progressive side to meet water supply challenges. The biggest thing that is probably different is that, generally speaking, of course, as you know, in Colorado, water is scarcer, over the course of a year, especially in the Front Range, than maybe in Georgia. And the other thing is, of course, very interesting is Colorado's water rights system adds a significant amount of complexity to everything you do relative to water supply and how that supply can be used. That's something, of course, they don't have in Georgia, and is handled significantly differently.
Mm-hmm. So when you refer to renewable supply, are you talking primarily about cities in Colorado relying on groundwater supplies? Or are you talking more about this Colorado water rights system where you're not able to reuse all of your supply?
Well, yeah, when I'm talking about renewable supply, of course, I'm talking about water that we get every year from rain and snow in Colorado. And, in Georgia, we didn't really use that term so much. Most of the, even groundwater in Georgia, most of it came from renewable water sources that were recharging into the aquifer. So the challenges were a little bit different in terms of what I would call renewable water. Castle Rock, of course, has what's termed a non-renewable water supply in the Denver Basin aquifer, and that's primarily, of course, because it's not recharging as quickly as it's being used, for sure, and the amount of recharge obviously may be minimal, or certainly significantly less than the rate it's being used, or at least that's the current science.
Got it. Okay. Perfect intro to the next question, which is where Castle Rock receives its water supply. So some of that is the Denver Basin aquifer. Any other surface water supplies?
Yeah, so Castle Rock water last year, about 70% of the supply came from the Denver Basin aquifer, or aquifers. Obviously, there's multiple aquifers that make up the Denver Basin, and 30% came from what we call our renewable supplies. And of course, the town is moving towards obtaining more what we call renewable supplies. We get water currently today out of East Plum Creek, which is the creek that runs through town. We have some fairly old water rights in that creek that we're able to use. We've got some newer water rights in the creek, and we have a surface water treatment plant we constructed back in 2013 that allows us to use that water. So that's one of our more recent primary sources for renewable water. And then, of course, you probably already know this. We're a member of the WISE Authority, which is a partnership between 10 South Metro water suppliers and Denver Water and Aurora Water and East Cherry Creek. And that allows us to access both, mountain supplies and what we call reuse water that Aurora provides.
Okay.
And so we're getting, and we call that imported renewable water, obviously, because it's coming primarily from areas to the north of us, and water that ultimately, came down the South Platte River, and came from rain and snow somewhere. And those supplies are being brought to Castle Rock through a bunch of infrastructure that's been constructed over the last 5 or 6 years. And so we're getting a significant amount of supply from that started back in April of 2018. So our renewable supplies are likely to go up this year relative to where we were last year. Hopefully we'll be roughly 40, maybe more, 40% or more renewable for 2019, and we continue to expand that each year, or at least that's the goal. And the other supply that we don't actually have in production yet, but will be in production in 2020 is that reusable supply. And the cool thing about that is, of course, all of our Denver Basin aquifer water is reusable.
Yeah.
The Wise water, believe it or not, is all reusable, even though some of that water, of course, comes from renewable water rights and renewable water that Aurora and Denver have.
Okay.
So currently, those are the major water supplies. We do have some water rights over on Cherry Creek, and we have some reusable water over on Cherry Creek that is currently recovered into Reuter Hess Reservoir.
Okay.
So that supply is already in place. But those are the major supplies. So.
Great. Great, thank you. Let's see, I think I had one question. Oh, then the Denver Basin aquifer supplies, is the basin, my question here is, what's the importance of moving to these renewable water supplies? Is the basin being drawn down by those who are?
Oh yeah, so sorry, that was part of that question, is what are our water supply challenges facing the town? Obviously, yes, that non-renewable groundwater resource over the next 50 plus years is certainly being drawn down, and that creates a couple of issues and challenges for the town. Number one, the groundwater becomes more difficult to recover over time as that's drawn down. It becomes more expensive to recover that groundwater. And obviously, in the really long term, we're depleting a resource that is not being renewed quickly enough. So Castle Rock's challenge and plan, of course, is to reduce our reliance on that supply, and in fact, in the long term, balance it out such that in years where there is more of our other supplies, our quote renewable supplies available, to actually put water back into the aquifer through a process we call aquifer storage and recovery.
Great.
Which we already, by the way, have several wells converted where we can put water back into the aquifer.
Great.
And take that water out. So it's basically becomes another storage reservoir for us. And in the long term, the idea is to protect that non-renewable resource as a drought supply.
Yeah.
Because it is, of course, it's not impacted by a drought like, say, your surface water resources are. So that's a part of our long-term plan. And then, the other water supply challenge facing the town, is that renewable water rights, of course, are somewhat limited at this point. We're a little bit late to the game, so the cost of those water rights is high.
Yeah.
And the ability to acquire those water rights can be challenging. And then, of course, those water rights are not close by, so it's not like they're over here in the creek, in East Plum Creek, or over in Cherry Creek. We generally have to import them from a fairly distant place, and the infrastructure to import that water is expensive. So, as an example, one of our long-term supplies that we're working on is what we call a project called Box Elder Creek, which is a watershed up in Weld County. And there's another watershed called Lost Creek. Those two watersheds, we own some water rights up in those areas, and long-term, hopefully, we're building the infrastructure to bring that water back to town.
Great. Do you know of any other cities in Colorado that are using aquifer storage and recovery right now?
Yeah, Centennial Water and Sanitation District, which is the water provider for Highlands Ranch
Yeah.
in Douglas County, they have been doing aquifer storage and recovery for quite a while now, and I know they have a significant number of wells already in place. And then there are a number of other South Metro water providers, some of which are part of the WISE project, that are also in various stages of developing some aquifer storage and recovery. I believe Meridian, you could certainly talk to them. They are moving forward with that. And then, several others are in various stages of looking at it or developing it.
That's great. Okay, so moving right along, and my first question for this next one that's related to reduced GPCD is whether or not you might have a more recent figure for me. I pulled from your 2015 water efficiency plan 108 GPCD, but that was from 2014.
Yeah, so that number is still pretty close. I know the last several years we're hovering right around that number.
Okay.
In terms of, our gallon per day per capita demand. It goes up and down slightly depending on the weather we're seeing.
Yeah.
That is one of the things we're really focused on in terms of the next steps in terms of water efficiency and conservation in Castle Rock. You may or may not have seen we updated our water efficiency master plan in 2016, and of course our new goal is to get that number down to around 100 gallons per capita per day.
Great.
As a kind of a permanent, reliable annual average. And you probably know a lot of this stuff. We're already doing a ton of stuff, of course, on the water efficiency and conservation side. You, I think, in your question, identified several of the most important things. The water budget-based rate structure that we use is certainly one of the key ways that we've been successful in getting folks to conserve and use water efficiently, because that rate structure is designed to encourage and incentivize people to use water efficiently. And I can certainly go into explaining how it works for us. We are working on a couple of improvements to that water budget rate structure, which I can certainly talk about as well. And then you also identified another area that we've done a number of things in, and that is the water resources or system development fees. We do have a couple of programs where developers can get a reduced fee if they do if they develop the projects with more water efficient approaches. And do you want me to go into the water budget rate structure stuff a little more? Would that be helpful? Or?
Yeah, that would be helpful. I mean, you don't have to walk through every single detail, but a little more context.
Sure. So the way it works, of course, is we have what we call an indoor water use rate, essentially, which is developed from the average customer's usage during the winter. So 4 months in the winter, that's assumed to be their indoor use. And every year their indoor water budget gets reset to that number. So we reset that every year for each customer, and that defines their indoor water use as well as their wastewater use.
Okay.
And then with respect to their outdoor use, which is kind of the next tier or the more expensive rate. So that indoor use is our least expensive water. And then that outdoor rate gets more expensive. and that's based off of the customer's actual irrigated area up to a maximum number that we allow.
Okay.
And that irrigated area, then their water budget for that irrigated area is derived from Kentucky bluegrass and the amount of supplemental water that needs. That is the area where we're making an improvement this year with respect to our water budget rate structure. This year, almost all of our commercial since 2004, our commercial and HOAs and other accounts have been required to put in hybrid grasses or native grasses that use a lot less water than Kentucky bluegrass. So they haven't been allowed to use Kentucky bluegrass since '04, and the water budget rate structure for those customers is being adjusted, and next year this will go into full effect. This year we're primarily doing outreach.
Okay.
Their water budget rate for their outdoor irrigation will not only be based off of irrigable area, but the actual type of landscape they have installed. What that'll essentially do is further reduce their outdoor budget, meaning they have to manage that water more closely and more efficiently.
Right.
And then, of course, with the water budget rate structure, if you use more water than your indoor and outdoor water budgets allow, then you pay a higher rate for that water.
Yep. Interesting. So is the utility then using like GIS technology right now to map all of those different types of landscapes?
Absolutely. So, in fact, for our commercial and HOA customers, we did a flyover last year, and then all of those various irrigated types of landscapes have been identified and calculated. And then obviously if you're using, say, a Texas hybrid grass, it's going to use 19 inches of water instead of 13 inches of supplemental water. We are now utilizing those numbers and calculating their actual water budget for those landscapes. We are also doing that for some of our residential customers already, but those are only for new customers that are in an area that was developed under a water efficiency plan. So that's a fairly small number of customers at this point, but that will be expanding as we go forward. Those water budgets for those customers will also be based on not only the irrigated area, but the landscape type. And that's long term, that's where we're moving for the entire customer base, but obviously we're taking that in steps for the customers that have been required to put in more efficient landscapes. The general residential customer base hasn't been required to do that, obviously, so that's going to take more time to transition.
Right. Okay. So let me just right. And to be honest, we might not go into this much detail in the interview, but I'm just curious. So let's say you have two residential accounts and one of them has installed total xeriscape and their entire front yard is xeriscape. And then you have another customer account that has, 50 to 60% turf and the rest is like bushes and trees or medium water use stuff. So those customers are both assigned a water budget. And let's say the one that's higher water using, their water budget is maybe like 2 or 3 times as high as the xeriscaping. So obviously they're going to pay more for that water because they're just using more water. But do those customers, are they being charged the same amount per gallon or, per
Yeah.
whatever the measurement is for
Yes.
that
Yeah.
water?
They are. They are. So the customer that has xeriscape may have a very limited irrigated area, and so their budget will be much smaller, but they are paying the same rate as the customer with, a significant amount of turf would pay for that water. So yeah, that's an interesting nuance to the way this works. You're assigned a budget based on what you need, and then you have to manage within that budget. Now, both customers can use more water than their budget. They're just going to pay more for that water.
Right. That's when the tier jumps up.
That's right.
Okay. Thank you. That is very helpful. Okay, moving right along. So I certainly didn't realize this, but apparently Castle Rock is the 7th fastest growing city in America, expected to reach 100,000 people at build out around 2060. So we talked a little bit about this. Additional strategies the city is considering in order to continue to develop sustainably and meet the water supply and demand needs of the community.
Yeah, absolutely. So a number of important things that we're looking at, of course, we're transitioning to renewable water supplies such that we have a diverse portfolio of those supplies that we can utilize in average and wet years, and then store water in our non-renewable aquifer for dry years. So that's one key thing. Some of the other interesting things that we're doing, of course, is obviously we have a robust water reuse program, which we'll talk about a little bit more, I guess, in the next question. But as a part of that, we are looking at what I call direct potable reuse, which you may or may not be familiar with that term, but that is more efficiently using our reuse water by directly bringing that water back from the water reclamation facility to our drinking water treatment, as opposed to putting it back into the creek, letting it flow downstream, and then taking it out. And the reason for that, of course, is it's more efficient from a cost standpoint, and it also ensures that we don't lose any of that water right to evaporation and or soaking into the sands in the creek, or other people taking the water out, those kinds of things.
Great.
So that's something we're working on. That's a little bit more of a long-term plan, but that's part of our long-term plan. And then, of course, we're continuing to look at new ways to incentivize so both, I say, incentivize and require more efficient development. So, those are things that also you've got some questions in here later on, but things like looking at how to incentivize more efficient toilets, incentivize tools for our customers to better manage their water, which, could mean devices on their service line that they can access through their smartphones to identify leaks and do other things. And then, of course, the landscaping. We've already done quite a few things in regards to the landscaping. For example, new houses are not allowed to do Kentucky bluegrass anymore in Castle Rock. And things like that will continue to be looked at, how we make sure those outdoor landscapes are as efficient as possible. And then transitioning the look and feel of the whole community to more what we call a Colorado scape. We've had a big push for that this year and last year, where we are utilizing the Colorado Scape. That's a name that we use for it here instead of Xeroscape, because we don't really like Xeroscape. It makes people think that you got nothing. And so we like Colorado Scape because the idea is that people use native plants and create a beautiful landscape that's just plain more water efficient and drought tolerant.
Yep. Yeah, it's a great term.
And, and of course, we're continuing to look at, the existing areas of turf in the community and converting those areas. And we'll continue to do that well into the future, whether that be things like partnerships with the Parks Department, where last year we basically helped fund converting baseball fields from Kentucky bluegrass to synthetic turf.
Great.
And, that had a huge impact on reducing water demand, and also, quite frankly, provided a surface that the Parks Department could utilize for a longer period of time and, during the year and program with more people. So it's been a good partnership there.
So multi-benefits of that project.
Yeah, exactly.
Great. I haven't heard much about direct potable reuse yet in Colorado. Do you know if the legislature or CDPHE has taken any interest in this?
Absolutely. So we're part of a group, actually Water Resources, Western Resources is part of this as well. But there's a group that is finishing up a project right now that's looking at direct reuse regulatory requirements for the state, how that might work. So Castle Rock and a number of other utilities and organizations are working on that right now. And that actually, the report for that, I think, is going to come out in late September or in October. And then Castle Rock will be working with some of those folks on next steps. The key issue at this point is there's not really a regulatory framework in the state that would, make it easy for a water provider to move forward with a direct potable reuse project in Colorado at this point. So the next step really is to help the state figure out how to develop those regulations so that water providers would have some certainty as to what they need to do to develop a project along those lines. And that's kind of where we're working with all those folks to develop something along those lines.
Yeah. I mean, you can look to Arizona as a starting place.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, Arizona and Texas, have certainly been doing some of that work and are moving pretty far along those paths. And it makes a lot of sense for some folks in Colorado. Not everybody, of course, because you have the water rights issues.
Yep.
Some of the water rights can't be reused, as you know. And so, it'll just depend on what your water rights allow you to do as to whether water providers in the state will be interested in direct potable reuse.
Okay. Great. So again, we touched on this, but a lot of articles about Castle Rock lately with your plan to develop the infrastructure or it sounds like that's already underway, to reuse treated wastewater as part of your water supply. So we feel like we've kind of answered this, but what was the impetus behind this decision? And maybe more importantly, how have community members responded?
Yeah, absolutely. So Castle Rock, of course, has limited water supply options, and one of the benefits of being reliant on the Denver Basin aquifer is all of that water is fully reusable to extinction. You know, we own the right to use it and reuse it as many times as we can. Our Wise water is fully reusable to extinction, so that water we're getting from Denver and Aurora through that project. So a number of our key supplies are reusable to extinction. The reason or the impetus behind it, of course, is necessity. Castle Rock needs to develop this sustainable, long-term, renewable water plan that will allow us to be less reliant on the Denver Basin aquifer. So that was really the impetus behind the decision to look at reuse. And believe it or not, that decision was developed back in 2005. And even was being looked at by Castle Rock before 2005. Certainly reusing water has been something that Castle Rock's been looking at for a long time, whether that be, you know, indirect potable reuse or non-potable reuse. So, Castle Rock has been reaching out to the community with respect to this and had community input since 2005, and for the most part, the community has been generally very supportive of this for lots of reasons. Again, because it's a water supply that we can count on, and then also because it's one of our most efficient, cost-effective water supplies, because we already own the water rights, and it's close to home. So it's actually more cost-effective for us than importing renewable water, you know, from Weld County, you know, up on the South Platte, Middle South Platte, or Lower South Platte.
Right.
So yeah, again, we have done a lot of outreach. We've been very transparent with the community to try to make sure they're fully educated on this. That has been a little bit of a challenge as we grow and have lots of new people moving into the community. So we've had to continue to be very strong in our outreach to the community on reuse and what's going on with it. We're in the middle right now of constructing upgrades to our surface water treatment plant that are designed specifically to treat a reusable water supply. And the way the supply works for us is the water will be treated at the water reclamation facility. It'll go back into East Plum Creek and flow 5, 6, 7 miles downstream. We have a diversion that will then allow us to pull that water back out after it's blended with the water in the creek. And then we're in the process of finishing construction on a pump station pipeline that will bring that back to our water treatment plant. And like I said, we're adding a bunch of new treatment processes to that plant right now that are specifically designed to treat that supply. And in fact, those treatment processes that we've designed, the treatment processes for this water plant such that we could do direct potable reuse with this treatment train in the future.
That's great.
So, so we're generally looking to have those treatment processes be robust enough to do that in the future if Colorado puts that in place and the regulations get put in place for that. So,
great.
So anyways, we're excited about it. It's going to be a very efficient and reliable water source for us. We continue to make sure the community understands that it is a very cost-effective, efficient supply, and that it's also a more drought-proof supply, quite frankly.
Yeah. And when will those supplies come online? What's the timeline?
So those supplies will officially be online kind of, third quarter next year. So fall 2020
Great.
Now we're completing a project actually in about 2 weeks that will allow us to use our reusable, non-potable reusable water for watering our golf course here in town.
Oh, great.
That will actually start up in a couple of weeks. So that's another form of reuse that we're moving forward. And of course, there's a lot of history with that already in this area because the water reclamation facility has been providing non-potable reuse water for a number of golf courses in our area for several decades.
Right.
So we're just expanding on that by adding another golf course here in Castle Rock.
Perfect. We've talked about this recently, but Castle Rock became the third city or county in Colorado this year to pass a gray water ordinance. What were the goals of this ordinance, and how would you measure success in 5 or 10 years?
Absolutely. The goal of the gray water ordinance, quite frankly, is to improve the water efficiency of future new residential homes in Castle Rock. And there's limited opportunities for improving the efficiency of indoor water use. Mm-hmm. And this is one of those opportunities. So we wanted to provide this as an option for home builders and developers in Castle Rock. We have provided, we've added gray water to our incentive structure. Mm-hmm. We don't know yet if we've provided enough incentive for it to actually move forward. Mm-hmm. The goal right now for Castle Rock is to work with the home builders and the providers of these systems to get a pilot project moving forward in Castle Rock where we can actually get a better idea of how this is going to work going forward. In my mind, success 5 years from now would be that we have figured out systems that allow new homes to use water more efficiently, and that the homes 5 years from now are actually using that technology, the new homes that we're building in Castle Rock.
That's great. Last but certainly not least, why do you think that sustainable water management in Castle Rock and throughout the Front Range is so important?
You know, it's really for the same reason that it's important everywhere. I mean, it's fun. Sustainable water is really the fundamental basis for society as we know it. Mm-hmm. It's perhaps the most important infrastructure and resource for public health, and going beyond literally anything else. Yeah. So I would say it's critical that we have sustainable water management everywhere in the country, in the world, quite frankly. But in Castle Rock and the Front Range, it's even more important, I guess, for a number of critical reasons. One being the region is growing at an extremely fast pace, yeah. And the water resource here is limited, and it is precious in terms of the amount available, and it's hard for infrastructure and new approaches to sustainably managing that water to keep up with the pace of growth. Mm-hmm. So we really have to focus, and we really have to be thoughtful in terms of how we make sure that we utilize that resource and develop the systems now that are going to be sustainable to support that growth here in Colorado. And then, of course, the other thing that, a lot of folks have on their mind is that we need to be prepared for changes in the amount of water that's available and how that water comes to us because of all the unknowns with respect to how things may change over time with respect to, of course, climate and other outside influences that we as water providers don't have a lot of control over.
Right. Great. Okay. Is there anything else that you wanted to follow up on, or anything else that you don't think that we addressed that you'd like to see included in this?
I think the only thing I would say is we are lucky here in Castle Rock to have leaders, council members, elected officials, and other folks, as well as customers, quite frankly, that are very supportive of using water efficiently and are very supportive and I think have a good understanding of how precious and important the resource is.
Yeah.
So we're lucky in that respect. I think it's not the same everywhere in terms of that. So I feel like Castle Rock Water and the town has a lot of support amongst the community to do what we need to do to make sure that we're sustainably managing the resource. So that's a pretty exciting thing.
Yeah, that's wonderful. Okay, excellent. I think that is all the questions I have. The one thing that I forgot to mention, Mark, is that typically our sustainability spotlight folks are Water Now members. And I don't know, I don't think that you have, I know that you attended our workshop in Denver on the Colorado Water Plan, but you probably don't know that much about us. And I certainly don't want to, force membership upon you if that's not something that you're interested in. But I will just send you a link. It's free to join Water Now Alliance, and we don't have any real requirements beyond that you're eligible if you're a council member, mayor, water district board member, or an executive manager. So, city managers, public works directors, those folks. We have about 70 members in Colorado. So on our website, you can see, your peers who are our members, and you can just consider if you think that makes sense for you. But no pressure, obviously.
Awesome. Well, I appreciate that. I'll take a look.
Yeah, great. So I'll send that over to you now, and then we will go ahead and transcribe and create the blog post, and we'll get it over to you next week to review.
That sounds great. I really appreciate it, Lindsay.
Well, thank you so much for your time this morning, and I hope you have a wonderful long weekend.
Same to you. All right, definitely. Have a good one, Lindsay. It was fun talking to you.
You too. Talk to you soon.
All right, bye-bye.
Bye-bye.